EVO. Hello, welcome back to The Devil Within. So we're doing something new starting this week. I announced it last week in support of the MGM Plus show, Let the Devil In, which is based on season 1 of The Devil Within. We're re-releasing season 1, and we're starting that today. So I'll give you a little background on each episode. I'll talk about where I was kind of creatively, who I interviewed for each episode, and where the story went, and how it parallels with the episode of the TV show that most recently aired. So last night, the 31st, episode 1 of Let the Devil In dropped on MGM Plus. The episode is entitled Shock, and it basically covers that night in January of 1988 in Jefferson Township, New Jersey, when, forgive me, all hell broke loose. So let's go back 5 years to when I started writing the podcast. In fact, we could go back a little further. We could go back about 10 years to when I first decided I wanted to do something creative with the Tommy Sullivan story. So I think the first iteration of the story was a feature film that I called Clinton Road. And that haunted stretch of road on the outskirts of my town was the setting for all of this evil that befell Jefferson Township. And now Clinton Road definitely was explored in the podcast, not so much in the TV show, but definitely it played a big role in the podcast. And then from that feature, I decided to expand it into an idea for a television series, like a horror kind of Riverdale haunted 90210 type of high school horror drama, whatever. None of those ever did much of anything, and I moved on to other writing projects. I wound up selling a show to Sony, and I was on the Sony lot for a while, and then that show didn't go, and so it was 2018 or 2019, and I needed a job, and a startup media company was interested in the TV version of the story, and they suggested that I turn it into a podcast. Now, by now it's 2020. I'm not a podcast guy. I'd never listened to a podcast. I certainly didn't know how to write a podcast, but they said, yeah, sure, neither do we, so go figure it out. And so, yeah, sure, I could do it. Didn't know if I could, but I figured it would be fun. I knew the material so well. I'm sure I could kind of figure it out, and I could find people who would talk to me about it. And so 2 days a week, while my toddler daughters were at gymnastics, I would walk to some days I'd walk to a skate park that was right down the street, and I'd get a session in, but other days I would go to this Greek restaurant, and I would sit there for 3 hours, and that's where I wrote the podcast. And so with this one, with episode 1, it's entitled In the Bleak Midwinter. So you'll notice that every episode of the podcast the title is either a poem or a line from a poem that I thought kind of paralleled or made sense thematically with what was going on in the episodes. Poetry is a big part of my life. It was growing up. It still is now. And I find a lot of joy and inspiration in poetry from all different eras and all different kind of regions. Other than the first poem here, In the Bleak Midwinter, which is a UK poet, I focused primarily on American poets from the Northeast where the tragedy occurred. And so episode 1, as I mentioned, the title is In the Bleak Midwinter, which is based on a poem, and I'll read you the opening stanza because that's the only part of it. The rest of it is beautiful and kind of haunting in almost a Dickensian kind of way about how a poor person experiencing the desolation of winter, but still wants to find something to give. But it opens in a way that just reminded me completely of the night that Tommy Sullivan did these horrible acts. And I got to put my glasses on. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan. Earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow on snow snow on snow in the bleak midwinter long ago. So you understand where I was and why that would make sense. The story happened 30 years prior to when I started writing it. And the main thing that I remember that night is how much it snowed and how heavy the snowfall was, and how normally that's such a blessing for, a 13-year-old kid, because you're going to have a snow day and you're going to go sleigh riding with your friends and have snowball fights with your brother and just really enjoy the innocence of a kid on a winter day. And all of that was just blown up by this horrible, bloody tragedy. And the snowfall from that night played a big part in the investigation. So the irony of what collectively the youth of Jefferson were hopeful for when the snow started compared to what dawn brought the next day was really drastic. So with regards to the episode, I'm not just going to replay the whole thing. There'll be chunks of it that are relevant to the TV show, and then I'll break in with some commentary and let you know what was happening. So first off, it's important to just let everybody know how lucky I got with this whole situation. From the creation of the show to selling the show to the success of the show. It was all kind of one lucky break after the next. The company that I was with, they paid to produce the whole show before we had sold it. So we spent a pretty significant amount of money to get everything done. We figured we would be in a more powerful position trying to sell it to one of the podcast networks if the season was completely done. And that turned out to be true. One of the biggest selling points of the series was that it was done and it was ready to go. And the network that bought it, turned out they had a couple of holes in their summer schedule because some other shows weren't done. And so that made our show really attractive to them. And then the fact that it was true crime made it a pretty easy sell for them. And then, because it's never easy, about 2 weeks before launch, we needed to fire the original narrator of the show. Originally, there was a different guy telling the story. He was a news anchor and had a lot of journalistic credibility. And my bosses figured that he's the guy to tell this story. And then it turns out he wasn't the guy to tell the story. And we needed to replace the narrator after the show was completely produced. And the network said, you need a new guy. We don't know who it is. And we can't change the release date. So you have 2 weeks to reproduce the entire series. And my boss went, okay, Branden, how about you do it? Because we don't know who else to go to. And they need a sample episode, so just go record it. And I'm like, where do you want me to record it? And they go, I don't know, figure it out. So I recorded the entire season in the closet of my bedroom, speaking into my hanging shirts. That was the only room in the house where there wasn't an echo and it wasn't bouncing off the walls. So that's where I was. My practice episode was approved and did the other 9 episodes. And then we made the release date and they marketed the hell out of it. And it went on to be a very successful show. And I'm very, very grateful for that.
Went into the house with him. There were books on the floor that were on fire. They were satanic books that were set up in a circle in the living room. We started stamping it all out. He's screaming for his family. At that time, the younger son comes out of his bedroom, and Tom asked him if he saw his brother and his mother. And he said, yeah, I saw Tommy. He was covered in blood. He said he cut his hand, and Mommy was taking him to the hospital for stitches. So the little kid went back to bed, apparently. I said to the senior, there you go, he cut his hand, your wife's taking him to the hospital. And he's like, no, both the cars are here. So I said, well, let's check downstairs. Get halfway downstairs. Tom looks to his left, sees his wife, who's been murdered, and just turns around and starts running out of the house.
In January of 1988, a small town in the woods of northern New Jersey was rocked by a night of terrible violence. This is the true account of the murder of Betty Ann Sullivan, a 37-year-old wife and mother of 2. the brutal, ritualistic nature of Mrs. Sullivan's murder only begins to scratch the surface of this heinous crime. Even today, more than 30 years later, the circumstances surrounding her murder are debated within the community. And of the people who remember that night that still live in town, there aren't many that are willing to talk about it. I was 15 years old that night, but I remember like it was yesterday, because my hometown became the flashpoint of a crisis that no one saw coming. The story made national headlines because it fit into a larger narrative, an idea, a fear that had existed for the most part within the margins of the American social landscape, but would now be standing front and center. That fear was given a name, the Satanic Panic, and it had all at once metastasized from whispered urban legend to hysterical national nightmare. From Cavalry Audio, I'm Branden Morgan, and this is The Devil Within.
You can run out for a long time, run for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down.
Betty Ann Sullivan lived a normal suburban life, happily married for over a decade to Thomas Sullivan Sr. They had 2 boys. Brian was 8 and Thomas Jr. was 14 in the winter of 1988. Together they lived in a nice house on a quiet street in a quiet community in the vast, enveloping silence of rural Jefferson Township, New Jersey.
Great place to raise kids, lots of kids around and lots of stuff to do, and neighborhood elementary school to walk to, which is kind of rare in New Jersey. So it just checked all the boxes for us.
That's Bobby Kennedy, lifelong Jefferson resident. Founded in 1804, the town was named in honor of Thomas Jefferson, the President of the United States at the time. Then, as now, the area was heavily forested, surrounded by acres and acres of forests, entire realms of forests. As a result, it's an isolated community, a tiny island of a town, nearly lost in a sea of endless, forbidding woods. The irony of this isolation is that if you wanted, you could drive out of that valley, hop onto Route 80, and be standing in the middle of Times Square in less than an hour. In the 3 decades since the murder of Betty Ann Sullivan, it's that combination of country living and the close proximity of New York City that has allowed Jefferson Township to grow into a desirable community for Manhattan rat racers who require a little breathing room. So the first voice that we hear is a man named Michael Kennedy. Unfortunately, the late Michael Kennedy. He passed a couple years ago from cancer. It was one of those 6-month things from diagnosis to burial. It happened. It was really quick. It was really aggressive. And it was really hard. I'll be honest. I grew up with the Kennedy family. And they, as a family, have had a rough 5 or so years. Of the 5 siblings, 3 have died. 1 during the COVID pandemic, and then Michael of cancer, and then Michael's little brother, Billy, had a pretty rough life, and he passed. And so the 2 oldest siblings remain, Bobby and Stuart, who factor heavily into the story as well. But that first voice that you hear, every time I hear the opening few seconds, I went into the house with him. That's the Michael Kennedy that I spent so much time with growing up, and was always a great and loyal friend. He was, handful of years older than me. But just like every other member of this Kennedy family, they just always seemed to be there when the chips were down. And there's no one else you'd want on your side if you know them. So, a little bittersweet reliving and re-listening to these episodes. But Michael was the first person to find the body of Betty Ann Sullivan. And it was a trauma that he lived with for the rest of his life, to the point where when the podcast came out, he has grown children in their 20s, and they'd never heard of it. Michael had never spoken about it, had never told them about what he had experienced that night. Apparently, it was witnessing something like that scars you, and it scarred Michael, apparently. But at the same time, it's just good to hear his voice, I guess. On the evening of January 9th, 1988, Thomas Sullivan Sr. was awoken from a deep sleep just before midnight. The smoke alarm in his hallway had been activated, and as you would hope, the ear-piercing squeal was more than enough to alert the house to a critical situation. Without noticing his wife hadn't come to bed, Mr. Sullivan left his bedroom to determine why the smoke alarm was going off. He immediately understood there to be a fire of unknown origin burning in his family room, contained primarily on his couch and the carpet surrounding it. The potential for the fire to spread was high, and he knew he needed some help. Thinking and moving quickly now, he raced back down the hall to wake his wife. It was then that he realized that she wasn't in bed. Mr. Sullivan then opened the door to Tommy's bedroom and found it empty. Although it was late, it was a Saturday night, and Mr. Sullivan knew that his neighbors across the street, the Eastmans, had college-aged kids who could be counted on to be up late on weekend nights, carousing around with their friends. In the 10 seconds it took to cross the snowy street to the Eastmans' front yard, Mr. Sullivan noticed something very strange. Strange, yet familiar. So familiar that it took him longer than it should have to process. He noticed his own car, running, yet slightly askew in the Eastman's driveway. A second glance, and he realized that his car had been backed into a bank of driven snow, left when the driveway had been plowed after a snowstorm the week earlier. The realization that took longer than it should have was this. Someone had stolen his car and almost immediately crashed it. Whoever it was must now be on foot. But for the moment, he needed help. The Kennedys were a Milton family of some renown. The local baseball field was named in honor of the late patriarch of the family, Robert. His widow, Anne, raised 4 boys and a girl on her own from the time they were adolescents: Bobby, Stuart, Michael, Billy, and Kellyanne. They were Irish Catholic, New Jersey to the core, as loyal as they come. They were what we call good people, and that distinction, good people, was all you needed at that time and in that place to be considered a person in good standing. On this particular Saturday in January, 3 of the Kennedy boys, Bobby was 25, Stuart was 24, and Michael was 22. They left their family home on foot, continued along White Rock Boulevard for about half a block until they reached the home of their friend, Chris Eastman. The Eastmans was a frequent destination on a winter weekend night. No work the next day, no worries about drinking and driving, just a warm place to relax with your friends over a few beers. This is Stuart Kennedy, another of the siblings who played a role on the night in question.
Walking up the driveway, and there was this car that was just askew at the end of the driveway, like a really poor parking job, and just assumed it was somebody from inside the party that just didn't know how to park. Walking up to the front door, the neighbor from across the street started yelling and screaming and running over. He reaches over me and starts pounding on the door, and the owner of the house, the father, opened the door up, and Tom, who was the neighbor from across the street, started explaining to him that somebody tried to burn his house down and his family was missing.
The oldest brother, Bobby, would stay in the house and call the fire department, while his brothers, Michael and Stuart, would assist Mr. Sullivan. They jogged back across the street, up the driveway, and to the front door. A quick decision was made that Stuart would stay with Mr. Sullivan and try to contain the fire, while Michael would go downstairs to look for the family. The fire in the family room proved relatively easy to extinguish. It seemed that most of the burned material had been newspapers and books. If they looked closer, Mr. Sullivan and Stuart would have realized that those materials were arranged in a specific pattern before they were ignited. Also, there was a specific subject matter that was consistent throughout the burning papers. But at least for now, the fire was out, and everyone could concentrate on finding the missing family members. This is Michael Kennedy, one of the younger siblings and the first civilian on the scene the night of the murder.
Went into the house with him. There were books on the floor that were on fire. Were satanic books that were set up in a circle in the living room. We started stamping it all out. He's screaming for his family. At that time, the younger son comes out of his bedroom. And Tom asked him if he saw his brother and his mother. And he said, yeah, I saw Tommy. He was covered in blood. He said he cut his hand and Mommy was taking him to the hospital for stitches. So the little kid went back to bed, apparently. I said to the senior, there you go. He cut his hand. Your wife's taking him to the hospital. And he's like, no, both the cars are here. So I said, well, let's check downstairs. Get halfway downstairs. Tom looks to his left, sees his wife, who's been murdered, and just turns around and starts running out of the house.
That's when they heard the primal scream from downstairs, followed almost immediately by the sound of the front door being thrown open and Michael Kennedy sprinting off into the night. Worried about his brother, Stewart followed without investigating what had caused such a reaction in Michael. But he would find out soon enough.
We were outside waiting for the police, and I heard my brother Mike yelling and come running out the front door and do like an Olympic jump across the front yard. There was fresh snow on the ground. I don't think there were more than 3 footprints in the snow. Yelling at there was a dead body inside.
Across the street and still on the phone with the fire department, Bobby wondered why his little brother was running home, seemingly scared out of his mind. Bobby would later remark that it seemed as though Michael covered the 60 or so yards from the Sullivan's lawn to his own in 3 giant leaps. Officer Bart McConnelly was less than a mile away when he got the call, but the snowy conditions slowed him down and it took him almost 10 minutes to arrive. It was the first 1028 of his entire career, brief though it was. In fact, it was the first 1028 he could even remember hearing about in Jefferson, maybe ever. He asked dispatch to please repeat. 1028 was the New Jersey police code for murder. That can't be right, he thought. Then dispatch repeated and gave further details. A civilian on scene claims that a woman had been murdered in the Sullivan residence on White Rock Boulevard.
So it took a good 10, 15 minutes for the police to show up. It was actually one of my brother's friends. My brother Stuart went into the house with him to help him search to see if they could find anybody.
Amidst the chaos that erupted in the psyche of Officer McConnelly as he tried to process what he had just heard, and what the next 15 minutes of his life would reveal, Bart McConnelly retreated to an emotional place that he understood. He stopped being a cop for a second and became a local kid with a problem that needed his friends.
Everybody started to get, anxious, nervous, like, there's a killer in the neighborhood.
In Jefferson, the one thing that made the youth of the town strong, the thing that made them survivors, was their numbers. They knew they didn't have to go into danger alone. And if you were considered a friend by the Kennedy family, you had an army at your side. Bart McConnelly wanted backup, and he trusted the Kennedy boys more than the cops he worked with. When he made this clear that he wanted one of them to go with him, they laughed. "You're out of your mind," Bobby said. "You have a gun, for Christ's sakes." "I know," he said, the realization seeming to be dawning on him in that moment. "It's just that every time we've ever had to go fight someone, Stewart always went first." That's all for now. We'll conclude in the Bleak Midwinter on the next episode. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please share it with your friends. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. Every little bit helps. And make sure you're following us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod. Please email the show at info@evocreative.com and make sure you're following us at The Devil Within Pod. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Branden Morgan.